Welcome to Cinemaphile, where we bring you the best in independent, documentary, and foreign films, and we talk to the people who made them. I'm your host, Mike Caspar, and you can find out more about the program by going to cinemaphilepod.com. So, Mark, tell me a little bit about your background in film. Where did you come from, and how did you develop this love of cinema?
Yeah, I always say in these types of interviews that I came into distribution the way that I assume a lot of filmmakers do, or at least it was true for me, which is through pain, specifically through my experience as a producer. And what's kind of ironic about my path is that I actually began my career on the distribution side, working in the marketing acquisitions department at Xenon Pictures in the early 2000s, which at the time was the largest distributor of urban Spanish language and alternative programming in the US. And then from there, I moved in producing. And for me, that's where the real education began. As a producer, I licensed films to distributors, but I found that with a lot of them, there was a lack of communication. I didn't feel like there was much investment into marketing. The films had really quiet releases, sometimes almost anonymously. And of course, if a film isn't marketed properly, the only people who ever wind up, seeing the money or are the distributor or the sales agent and seeing the movie is us, basically. I felt like the filmmakers, the people who sacrifice years of their life to make the work almost didn't see a dime, and then people didn't get to see the work that they made. So beyond like the opaque accounting and inexplicable deductions and creative math and unfriendly waterfalls that were filled with like hidden fees and delivery charges and reserves that somehow never got spent. I felt like the deepest problem with the model for me was just what was a fundamental lack of collaboration. It didn't ever feel like there was a partnership. So I would license a film, and the next time I'd hear from a distributor, was when a report was due, if I heard from them at all. And to me, the idea that the creator would have no meaningful involvement in how their film was released was just deeply wrong. So I approached it from this perspective of, trying to look at what those pain points I had experienced were, how I would resolve that. And the way that I started to tackle that was to start with partnership and communication and, really aligning with filmmakers that I wanted to work with that I felt like had a shared vision. And then everything else could sort of be rebuilt from there. So when the pandemic hit, it really gave me the time to do that. All of us, stopped making movies, and it gave me a forced pause to sort of reflect on what, my failures were, certainly as a producer, but also what I felt the failures were from a distribution sales perspective. Take stock of what didn't work, and then try to design a new model, one that I would like to think is rooted in transparency and collaboration, as I mentioned, and just a genuine alignment between distributor and filmmaker. Of course, when I was doing this at the time, my intent was not to move into distribution full time. I thought I was going to go back to producing movies, and really the Forge was created to be a vehicle for me to continue producing, but then manage my own distribution and sales. That's not what wound up happening. We sort of had some early success. And then I had contemporaries start asking me, would you be interested in, helping manage the distribution and sales on this title? I mean, it felt like it was overnight. I know it wasn't. Fast forward a couple years and, with the team that we've built, that's all we're doing now. Is I always say we're a North American distributor first, international sales agency second, for the few titles that we do acquire worldwide rights to. But yeah, that's kind of how I got here.
You're just describing how often these films, the sort of the flower that blooms in the wilderness that no one sees. I just think about all the filmmakers who put all of their efforts and all their time and years of work into their first film, doesn't go anywhere, and their voice disappears off the creative landscape because they just put everything they had into that film, and it went nowhere, or very few people saw it. I'm always wondering because I've seen some great first films in my life, great first films, but they didn't make any money. And I
Yeah.
just wonder, like how many voices have we lost over these years because of that?
I mean, sadly, I think that's kind of par for the course, and there's a pretty staggering statistic. Don't even remember, transparently, I don't remember who told me this. And I think it was, they were referencing a report that the MPAA had made, but there was something to the tune of 7,500 independent films that were produced on an annual basis, and less than 800 of them secured distribution. And that kind of tells you a lot about how much film art that we're not even having the opportunity to see or digest or contemplate. And that number to me is astounding and honestly shameful. And I think that was a big part of how I sort of made peace with, I'm going to leave the producing to people that are better at it than I am, but I, felt like my calling was to start helping those producers on the distribution and the sales side of things.
Yeah. This isn't exactly an apples to apples comparison to what you just said, but Damien Chazelle was on for his first film. It was called Guy and Madeline on a Park Bench. He remade the same movie, and it's called La La Land.
Yeah.
To me, that's a great example of someone who didn't make any money, somehow got an opportunity to make another film, but that could have been it. And he's one of the fish that swam upstream hard enough to be able to get over that first film because it didn't make any money. And when I
Yeah.
tell people about that film, yeah, what are you talking about? But it's the same film. He got to make it twice.
Totally. And I think that there's a handful of those circumstances where filmmakers are lucky enough, to have the opportunity to revisit, work that probably didn't didn't have the luxury of the experience or the budget
Right.
or, the personnel to be produced properly. Part of all of this that's hard is there are lessons that you have to learn. And the only way that you learn those as a producer is by going out and doing, by producing. And people will even tell you these things beforehand. You have to do it and like fall on your face and
Yeah.
make the mistakes and learn the hard way in order to do things the right way. There's just no way around that, really.
Yeah.
What I do think is important and a big part of what I'm, really trying to do at the Forge and when we work with filmmakers or, take meetings with filmmakers, while the entry point might be with respect to a film that they want us to consider for potential acquisition, I'm as interested in talking about what they're doing next too. And I think, the responsibility that a producer has if they really really want to grow into a place where they're making films that are commercially viable and have the best chance of success is that you do need to discourse with distributors and sales agents and agencies before you do that and make sure that you are doing the things that you can do that are within your power prior to making the movie to put it in the best position as possible. Or maybe you have the privilege of not having, that's not a concern. If that's the case, then I think, you're one of the lucky few. You're in the 1%. Go make what you want to make. You don't have to worry about that. If you're concerned at all about the commercial viability or about putting it in a position where people are actually going to be able to see it, then you need to know what like the market realities are. Because one of the things to me that I don't want to say it was shocking, but as a producer, there were things that distributors and sales agents would tell me that I was like, that can't be true. If the idea is good and the film is good, it has to work on the merit of the quality of the movie. Being on the other side of the fence now, there's a lot of those things that they were telling me that are true, right? There are hard truths to it. There are some of the things that, they did or told us that either weren't true or I, feel like we've found a more filmmaker friendly solution for. But a lot of the things are very true. There's hard market realities about making a movie that every independent filmmaker should know. A lot of them are obvious, right? Which is like cast profiles matter more than ever. Without recognizable names, the marketing shifts almost entirely to critical response and word of mouth, which is just going to take that much longer to mobilize. You're going to put yourself in a much better position if you have cast that has market value. I know that that's probably one of the hardest things for independent producers to swallow a lot of the time because that's directly tied to what the budget of the project is. But the reality is, if you're not able to pull the favor to do that, you really do need to maybe take the time to reevaluate whether or not you should be making the movie at this level. I think gone are the days where a lot of micro budget or very low budget filmmaking were resulting in properties that were turning sort of a unique profit. And we've kind of fallen backwards into a place where, regardless of whether or not it's actually true and the audience cares, it's optically true for distributors, foreign distributors, and sales agencies is that cast profile matters. So knowing that if you're not going to self-release your film, which is something I'm sure we'll talk about here in a little bit because it's always a big part of my pitch. If you're not going to self-release, then you need to know that stuff matters. So it's going to be really hard to secure distribution or find a meaningful sales agent to represent the property without a cast profile that has inherent market value. I also think indie audiences, speaking now as a distributor, they engage like really deeply, but they kind of mobilize slowly. They're really appreciative and loyal and like discerning about the titles they like, but they don't rush to theaters the way broader demographics do. So it's really important to understand that's going to be a general challenge for any independent film and really honing in on what your audience ID is going to be and leaning into that during the production, of the film. I also think, a hard truth is that theatrical is often a loss leader at this level. It builds cultural awareness. It's not necessarily going to result in a ton of revenue. If it does, that's great. But most limited engagements, they almost never recoup their spend, right? They're making the film more relevant in the zeitgeist for when it passes into, the digital and VOD
Exactly.
window and certainly, trying to secure some sort of P1 streaming or pay TV license. And, second to theatrical being a loss leader, I also think the hard reality now is digital and VOD performance is like unpredictably volatile. Even with strong films and strong marketing, I think traction in the long tail can be really erratic during this window. So again, you have to realize for independent films, the distributors that you're discussing potential acquisition with, the way they're really evaluating most of the risk calculus is based on what they think the P1 streaming license, pay TV license is going to be. It almost dictates the entire risk calculus for them. I think the problem there too is that those licenses for a lot of intimate indies have also contracted sort of dramatically. Even exceptional films with no commercial hook struggle to secure meaningful fees. And I say all of this like not to be doom and gloom. And there are ways around all of this and ways to make these windows more inherently valuable. But you should know if you're going to choose to have a third party or hopeful to have a third party that's going to distribute or sell this movie, these are the realities that they're dealing with. And I think there are a lot of things that you can do as a producer that help make any film more worthy in their eyes. And sometimes that means having the hardest conversation that a producer can possibly have, right? Which is, should this film be made at all? Like I said earlier, if your goal is purely creative, that's wonderful. You get to ignore everything I'm saying right now. But if your goal is for people to see the film or for it to have any commercial life, then I think these considerations really do matter. And I think the real challenge of independent filmmaking isn't making the movie, it's deciding whether or not it should be made at all.
Thank you for that. That's a great wide-ranging answer to so many of the questions that I think as any filmmaker would have, especially just starting out. Are you seeing a tightening of the market in terms of the availability of platforms, whether it be in a theater or VOD? On some levels, it feels like, well, there's so many more options. We've got so many more of the platforms that we can see things on. But at the same time, it feels like the market is tightening in terms of who is in control of those markets or of those opportunities. Is that how do you feel on it?
I think the market is tightening dramatically. It seems to me to be harder than ever to find, appropriate homes for titles, certainly on the streaming P1 pay TV end of things. Those licenses have contracted dramatically. The mandates that are being put on their acquisitions teams, I think, are a lot more rigid and harder to meet for most independent films than they used to be. I think gone are the days where there was kind of a mass grab for content, and the acquisition strategies are becoming much more focused and the budgets smaller. It's getting more difficult, but in that fact means that we're at, to me, what would be a really big inflection point where something has to change, right?
Yeah,
This isn't,
exactly.
it doesn't feel sustainable, certainly for the filmmakers, but I would even say for a lot of distributors and, sales agents, and particularly, by the way, like sales agents on the foreign side of things, it's getting even harder and harder to effectively distribute non-English speaking titles in this country and Canada as well. I think North America in particular is becoming kind of a difficult demographic for that. What are the options, left? And I think the key option in the way that I think this goes, looking at it as a distributor and saying this out loud, which I don't think a lot of people want to admit, but that's going to be films are going to have to start self-releasing more than they already are. The three barriers to entry there to me are one, a lack of knowledge and know-how, and there's a lot to know to effectively release a film. So there's that part's hard. You have to put in the time or have somebody show you the ropes to learn how to do it. That being said, there are resources and portals available to independent filmmakers now, through a variety of different aggregators that will work with you, that will let you direct release, for a fee onto, all of the digital and VOD portals. There's four they can basically guarantee, which is usually like Apple, Amazon, Google Play, Fandango now. All of the digital or all of the VOD for like cable and satellite is pitch dependent, and there's a few other digital platforms that way as well, AVOD and other free to stream platforms. But those options are open to you now. Three barriers: knowledge and know-how. The second is having the marketing money, right? Because you do have to have that, which is why I think ultimately most independent filmmakers may still choose to engage a third-party distributor, as they want somebody who has the expertise in doing it and is willing to put up, some money to market it. That's the hope of why you would engage one. I think the hard reality is there's a lot of mid-tier distributors that they have the knowledge and the know-how. They're not necessarily going to put much marketing money behind it. And that's where filmmakers, I think, will find themselves in scenarios where they're like, what happened? We didn't make anything. And that's because the movie wasn't marketed, which is why self-releasing, if you have access to the marketing money, becomes much more attractive. You're cutting out a middleman. You're in control of the marketing and the creative of the marketing. But the third part of it is just, in addition to the knowledge and the know-how, is the amount of time it takes to effectively distribute a film and in its release trajectory, push it through each portal and passage. And, having been a producer, there is a lot in distribution at times when we're releasing films where I'm like, oh my God, this is as much work as it was making a movie, just to release it. So I think the way you start to resolve some of this opportunity issue and the contraction of the platforms acquiring content, or even the availability of the platforms to acquire content as they start to get more homogenous, which I think you're going to see a lot more of in the next couple of years. Certainly, we're aware of a couple titans that are planning to merge together. I think self-releasing is the future for a lot of independent filmmaking, certainly for anything below like $2.5 million. I think you need to start seriously considering it as an option. It's just going to be the best option available to you if you have the ability to do it. And the more automated those processes get for independent filmmakers, the more doable it will be for them to self-release. So I think there's a lot, or there should be a lot of time and effort into thinking about what are the things that we can do to make it easier for independent filmmakers to self-release. And I think there's a lot of opportunity if you start thinking that way.
Well, maybe that's another conversation. I'd love to have you back on just to kind of talk about what you're just talking about in terms of self-releasing. What does that entail? But let's talk about the Forge. Let's talk about I mean, we've gotten into some of your philosophy on what you want to do, and it sounds like you want to be, and it's an overused word, but a little bit of a disruptor in terms of how you go about bringing films to market and who you want to work with, those kinds of things. So let's talk about that.
In essence, we want to be the distributor that filmmakers want to work with. We want to be open, we want to be collaborative, transparent, strategic, and refreshingly honest. And in that honesty, I think a big part of that is saying the hard stuff out loud, which is, if a filmmaker's better off self-releasing, I tell them. I tell them there's powerful tools that are available to you that would enable you to bypass us entirely. And if you have the knowledge, the time, and the marketing resources, this might be the best path for you, right? But I think most producers don't want to manage all three, and that's why we exist, for the right films. Our goal really is pretty simple, and that's to simply build the company we wish existed when we were on the other side of the table. And one of the things I think that distinguishes us from some of our contemporaries is that all of our executive team is composed of either former filmmakers or people that are still making films, outside of the work that they do for the Forge. So it allows us, when we say it's a cliche, the for filmmakers by filmmakers, but I feel like for us, that really is true because all of us have been there or are there still and have experienced those trials and tribulations and the difficulty of trying to navigate that really tricky landscape. So when we talk to you about it, it's not just speaking as a distributor to a filmmaker, but as a filmmaker who is a distributor to a filmmaker. Outside of that component of it, I think my vision for the Forge is to build a modern prestige distributor, one that can sit credibly alongside these really amazing companies like A24 and Neon, but maybe with a slightly different DNA. We're not trying to be everything to everyone. We want to be known, for care, taste, transparency, and long-term relationships. So certainly where we are right now, the most important thing to us, rather than producing some massive turnover, not that that isn't important, obviously it is, to the health of the company and the sustainability of the operation, but we want to be aligned in terms of chemistry and creativity, and we want to be a partner with the filmmakers, not just for this film that we would be releasing right now, but for the work that they will do in the future as well. So building those partnerships and cultivating those relationships is sort of the core ethos of the company. I do feel there's a real vacuum opening in the marketplace as some larger independents start to move toward more like commercial blockbuster driven strategies. So I think that is leaving some of these filmmakers with really singular voices that are searching for partners who actually want to fight for their work, and that's the space I hope that we're stepping into if we're not already there.
That's great. That's great to hear. But there are a couple of distributors that I seem to gravitate to when their films. Music Box is another one that does a really nice job of bringing really quality films, lower budget films to market. I really like what they do.
They
And
do a great job. I think Janice is doing a similar thing.
yeah,
There's a handful that are really focused on quality over quantity,
yeah,
and that's a model that I really appreciate. And I don't. I know sometimes I might use the word, but I kind of hate the word competitors because I think there's so much space for everybody
yes,
to operate, and we need more distributors that are willing to operate in that space for the exact reason that we started this entire
yeah.
conversation off with, which is there aren't enough homes for the amount of really incredible independent films that are being produced, while also recognizing, there's going to be some in that large number on an annual basis that don't need a home, but
Yeah.
there are a ton that do, and it's a shame. It's just really a shame that they don't have.
Um, Mark, may I suggest an idea?
Yeah,
Start thinking out loud.
please.
Over the last, I told you I've been doing this about 13, 14 years. There are maybe hundreds, but certainly over 100 films that I think you could go back and revisit for a re-release that would be viable today. They're the kind of films that are just they still hold up. And I think there's a tremendous amount of those kind of films that never saw the light of day, basically, but provide a lot of content that it would be marketable to this day.
The prospect of returning to films that didn't have the opportunity that they should have is super exciting to me. I think the difficulty in tackling those challenges is simply that from a for-profit or from a risk perspective for a for-profit company, I think it's a little scary to go to library titles and put much or resources or marketing behind them. That being said, because I agree with you, not only, as a film fan myself, but somebody that also deeply believes in second chances, that's actually a pain point that I've been trying to resolve through another company completely independent of the Forge, and one that's actually a nonprofit, which is the Vashon Film Institute, which I founded a few years ago to coordinate and host the Vashon Island Film Festival on the island where the Forge is, which is going into its fifth year. But we now have this film incubator that's taking projects in. There's a nonprofit film sales division that's a part of the NPO itself, and we're also looking to expand into distribution there too. And what really excites me about the idea of a nonprofit film distributor is that they're going, it will have access to grants and resources, and public and state and federal funding that will allow it to take risks that I think a for-profit company can't take.
Hmm.
And part of the reason I think that's worthwhile is the risks that a for-profit company is assessing, whether that's a smaller boutique distributor or a major motion picture studio, doesn't mean that they're true, right? Everything to me on that side of the fence is just what we optically believe to be true, what we think is the case, but we don't actually know because nobody will take the risk to see what the reality is. So my gut feeling tells me that there is an audience for these movies. We've been told that there isn't, but there actually is. And in the case of, the Vashon Film Institute, when it is able to, formally open, operations as a nonprofit distributor, I'm very, very excited about discovering whether or not that is true, what I believe to be true.
Good luck, because
Thank you.
I
Yeah.
in my heart believe it to be true. And again, you're right. I lead with my heart when it comes to film, and not necessarily with the from the point of view of what's actually feasible. But I've seen way too many really good films that just didn't make a nickel. And I refuse to give up on that artistic vision. I can't give up on it. And I could name, like I said, I could name a couple hundred, I'm sure, if I had a list of these films that I've interviewed, that I would say they were good. And it wasn't like they were the kind of, even they weren't like divisive, like you either love it or you hate it, that kind of, there's tons of really quality films out there that for whatever reason, the vagaries of the marketplace, they were in the wrong place at the, wrong time and all that stuff. So,
I do think the next chapter of independent film to me is really going to be defined by honesty. The old mythology that every great indie will magically break out, we know now just isn't true anymore, right?
right.
But filmmakers deserve to have clear-eyed conversations about what's possible, what isn't, what trade-offs they're making. All of that being said, if we want to make change, and we want to, have better films available to us, higher quality, more thoughtful, meaningful film and art, the ultimate responsibility really rests with us as an audience, right?
Yes.
You can change the risk calculus of distributors if you show up for those movies. Distributors on one hand obviously have to do a better job of making these films visible and accessible, but the audience also has to meet them halfway.
Right.
If people don't show up, the system isn't going to change. Saving independent film, to me, is a shared responsibility, and we owe it to one another to engage with the work we say we value. I say that simply because there have been circumstances where I felt like the audience didn't show up for the film that everybody said they wanted.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think, when you're making decisions about what you're going to go see this weekend, it's important to show up at the theater for the independent films as well and not just wait for them to be available on streaming platforms before you decide to watch them.
Well, how about this? Even leaning into what I just said before we got started. Guy and Madeline on a Park Bench, Medicine for Melancholy, Middle of Nowhere. These are films of Ava DuVernay, Barry Jenkins, and Damien Giselle. They didn't make any money. Nobody saw them. And why is it that we suddenly the line is drawn at independent films, and it's a relatively nebulous kind of designation of what an independent film is. There's sort of, it's kind of a weird, you can't really define it. But there are tons of really truly independent films out there. Why isn't the history of independent films kind of hold some weight when we talk about the history of comedies or history of what there's a lot of reasons, rationales to be able to say they're good films. And that should be enough. And we have to figure out a way to essentially reintroduce them and or make the case for them. That's just well, a good film's a good film. And I would argue that Middle of Nowhere, Medicine for Melancholy, and that Guy and Madeline on a Park Bench are really good films.
Absolutely. I'm so excited again about the idea of revisiting these films that didn't have those opportunities and finding opportunities for them now. But I also think what you've just outlined to me is so important, even in what our philosophy
Yes.
is at the Forge, which is when we acquire a film, we don't see ourselves as like the gatekeeper, of it. We see ourselves as partners. I really do think chemistry matters, alignment matters. We want to share a vision with the filmmakers so that we can execute it together.
Mhm.
I think the only way independent films succeed, however we're going to define that, is only when everyone is rowing in the same direction. And that means strategically, logistically, creatively. And this is what those films did not have. We actually market the films we acquire, which is why we don't acquire very much,
Mhm.
Even with boutique resources, we don't pick up anything, we don't believe in. If we take a film It's because we believe there's an audience for it, and then we put our money where our mouth is.
Right.
You know, every film that we acquire, with the exception of maybe a couple, gets at least a limited theatrical release. It gets PR support. It gets, a paid media strategy, programmatic and print advertising when it's justified. I don't just want to dump release anything. That's what happened to me. I just think so much of that, what you've talked about, and the hardships that these past films have had, are the kind of things I'm trying to be the distributor that isn't going to do that to the same types of movies.
Good on you.
And
Yeah.
it's probably harder, easier said than it is done,
Well,
right?
then let me pose another sort of element that's, I think, relatively new. I don't know how much traction it's gotten so far. It's intriguing to me, the idea of these micro cinemas. Is that present an opportunity? And let's define them. That's again another nebulous terms, but they're kind of popping up. Smaller theaters, more community based. They're in smaller niche markets, if you will, of bigger cities, small cities, wherever. But they're popping up. Maybe 100 seats in a theater, maybe less. Does that provide sort of an opportunity to essentially test the water with these films? Because inherently in a micro cinema, to my mind, you're building at a kind of a sensibility. This isn't a Marvel comic film we're going to see. We're going to see something that is more in the vein of an independent film or a documentary film or a foreign film that maybe won at Cannes but didn't get any distribution. I mean, it was just unfathomable to me. But so there are a ton of those. Again, I know this is a very broad question that I'm asking and kind of posing, but is that a testing ground to see if this is feasible?
Definitely. I think the micro cinemas are going to have the latitude and the flexibility to be more focused with their programming. The difficult thing with, a theater, 150, 200, 300 plus, they have to focus on programming titles that are going to fill as much of that space as possible.
Of course.
And, even with small independently owned and run, theaters all across the country, or the world for that matter, really struggle with this balance between wanting to have high quality, thoughtful, intentional programming, but then also making sure that they deliver the big budget blockbuster titles, whether or not we like it, people do show up for those.
That's
Um, and the difficulty, especially with single screen theaters that they have, is often the studios are going to require that's all you can program that week. If you have one screen, you can't program anything else there. And if a single screen theater isn't able to bring independent offerings in the weeks that they have the blockbusters there, man, that just means there's barely going to be anything there that is independent. So I like the idea of having more of the micro cinemas that don't have to program as much of the blockbuster titles, be more focused on very niche, specific type of programming that people, like you and I or cinephiles can go, where do I know I can watch the next PTA film? Where do I know, in our case, distributing Chronology, see Kristen Stewart's directorial debut. We need to have more of those, and I do think you have a lot of them popping up. As I mentioned before, we started the interview. We're also, becoming more aware of micro cinemas that only have, 12 to 25 seats, but they're offering more of an experience where a
yeah.
dinner is provided. It's an actual night out, and the ticket prices on those experiences are much more substantial, than a single screening ticket to your local chain theater, but they're going to present the film in a much more, memorable way. And I think there's a bright future with all of that. And again, at the end of the day, there will be even more of a bright future if we show up for those things.
I think people are getting out more. I think people are more in the habit of getting out post-COVID. But I just keep coming back to this, and that is in an intimate setting, as you said, two or 300. I'm thinking 100. I would look at a micro cinema is anything under 200 seats. I maybe I don't know what the definition is, but that's sort of in my mind. And if it's in a neighborhood, you're not going to drive. Maybe I don't know. This is sort of a not quite thought through point of view I'm expressing, but nonetheless, getting people into cinemas to see you have a unique experience with a group of people. I think we're ready for that. I think we are. That's the beauty of cinema. Walking out of the theater, sharing a conversation with somebody in the lobby about what you just saw is the essence of why we go to film. I mean, one of the things, one of the unique things about going to a cinema. So I will keep this eternal flame burning as long as I can because I think that's the best experience. I can walk into a megaplex and see a really good Marvel comic film and be blown away by oh my God, the spectacle and all that stuff, and walk out straight to my car and never think about it again. Or I can come out of a theater thinking about what I just saw. And I just think that that's the impression that people should have when they leave a film theater.
I really couldn't agree with you more. Well said.
What you're doing now, The Forge, you mentioned Kristen Stewart's film Chronology of Water and others, Black Dog, uh, and others that you are bringing to market. What is the future? What are you looking at? And what is sort of how do you feel right now? And where do you want to be in a year or two or whatever it is, whatever your timeline is?
We're trying to be very intentional about the slate that we're building. Empirically, we've cut our teeth on what I would call like prestige world cinema and documentaries, films that you mentioned, like Black Dog, Suho, We Were Dangerous, Resonator, Boom. These are all titles that played at Cannes and Sundance and South by Southwest and beyond, or, in Black Dog's case, was nominated for a Gotham Award and a Spirit Award, and Suho was Mexico's entry last year for Best International Film at the Oscars. These, to me, are the titles that have really, helped establish our taste and what I'd like to think is our credibility. We're also, and I think the Chronology of Water really signifies this, expanding into the prestige domestic space as well. Films like the Chronology of Water that have a really strong artistic spine, just like the rest of our slate, but also have clear pathways to audiences here at home. To me, that doesn't mean like chasing trends. It means being disciplined about what we acquire, why we acquire it, how we release it. And it also doesn't mean abandoning what has gotten us here. We see ways we can improve our release strategies. And to me, if we're not learning, we're not growing. And I think the Chronology of Water is a really landmark moment for us here. It's emblematic of everything we certainly want the Forge to stand for. It's bold, it's intimate, it's uncompromising. It's a deeply personal, film based on a memoir. But I also think it's very cinematic and accessible in a way that invites audiences in rather than pushing them away, especially from this type of subject matter. And I think Kristen didn't approach this as like a vanity project or a debut by committee. She really directed this movie with total and utter conviction. From the moment we saw it in Cannes, we knew it wasn't just a film, it was really a statement by a young woman that I think at the end of her career isn't going to be remembered as an actress first, but as a director. What excited us the most was that this film really sits at the intersection of artistry and market value. It's a film with real cultural weight. It's anchored, by Kristen now as a first-time filmmaker and Imogen delivering what to me is unquestionably the performance of her career. And I think that combination allows us to build a release strategy that's ambitious but also grounded in reality. And I just really couldn't be more proud to be the distributor of this film. And I just think Kristen's remarkable. Imogen is remarkable. The entire production team, Maggie McLean at Nevermind Pictures, they're all just remarkable women making incredible films. And Kristen only directs her first film once, so it's very exciting.
When can people see this or where?
It just finished its qualifying release in New York and LA, but it opens nationwide on January 9th. And at the beginning of the year, the new year, I should say, we'll be releasing where all of those theaters are on the film's website, which
Yeah,
is the chronology of water.film.
very good. By the way, as an aside, Alison Tavell was on for Resynator, had her on for that. What a wonderful documentary. What a terrific, not only was it about this obscure musical modulator instrument, whatever you want to call it, but the road to finding her father in the film is truly moving.
Another incredible filmmaker and a remarkable film. I think that particular title for me just transcended its subject matter and
Mhm.
became something about something much bigger. And that was really, bridging a gap between the living and the dead. And I just was blown away by her work on that film.
Amen. Yeah, and that's the essence. That is the essence of independent filmmaking. It's one of those
100%.
films. You love it.
Yeah. We've got some exciting stuff even planned, for that film with some, collectible hard media and
Good.
a couple of other things in the new year.
Well, very good. Mark Sayre, thank you for so much of your time today. Really appreciate it. Again, as the founder, president of The Forge, a distributor with a heart, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with us here on Cinemaphile. Thank you.
Thanks for having me anytime.
You have been listening to Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar, the place where you will hear from the best in independent documentary and foreign filmmakers. Please check out our previous interviews as well as upcoming interviews and special programming by going to cinemaphilepod.com. We are also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, searchable under Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar. Until next time, thank you for listening.